Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to wait a few minutes, let people trickle in, and then we will get started. Okay, I think we might still have some others joining us, but I might just get started with our intro so that we don't keep anyone waiting. Hi, everyone. Just before we get started, just wanted to let you know that this program is being recorded, which I'm sure you saw when you joined, and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum and Classical Theater of Harlem's Facebook and YouTube pages, as well as on dyckmanfarmhouse.org after tonight. So welcome back, everyone, to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series, Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation. I'm Meredith Horsford. I'm the Executive Director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. We are delighted to continue this lecture series, which we began in August of 2020, which was so successful that we have decided to continue it as a biannual series. So thank you for those of you who joined us in the past, and welcome to those of you who are just joining us for the first time tonight. This time we are offering a 4-week series hosted in partnership with our neighbors, Classical Theater of Harlem. This series will center around social justice and advocacy, how advocacy groups and arts and cultural organizations participate and lead in social justice movements. This series was created at a time of great unrest in this country due to the murder of unarmed Black people, as well as the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in conversation on a topic that is sometimes uncomfortable. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things as it relates to Zoom, so that you make sure we get your questions answered before we leave here tonight. Please make sure you use the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen to say hello to everyone and to ask Melissa, our Director of Development and Community Engagement, any technical assistance questions. During the lecture, if you have questions for our speaker, please click at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button, and we will make sure that we get those answered probably at the end of the talk. So we at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum thank everyone for joining us this evening. We feel strongly that our programming remains free of charge so that it is accessible to all. The response to this lecture series has been overwhelming, and there is clearly a need for us to talk more about the issues that divide us and the issues that unite us as Americans. As a small nonprofit organization, we rely on grants and donations to support these programs. This series, is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council, the Honorable Udonis Rodriguez, New York City Council District 10, and the former Manhattan Borough President, Gail Brewer. Additional funding has also been provided by TD Bank. If you would like to make a donation to help us to continue our community-focused programming, they're always greatly appreciated. In lieu of a donation, we are also selling some great Dyckman Farmhouse merch, which you can access through the link that is in the chat. A purchase helps support our cause, further research, and provide educational programming. Tonight, we are joined by Deborah Schwartz, independent consultant for arts and cultural organizations. Some cultural institutions are setting their sights on democracy and social justice. What does it look like in our programming, our governance structures, and our community relationships. In this talk, Ms. Schwartz will look at some well-received examples of exhibitions, oral history projects, and community-driven programs that reflect the current push to bring the forces of equity from the street into the hallowed halls of our museums. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Deborah Schwartz, presenting Museums Respond to the Demand for Social Justice. Are we creating a sustainable mashup? Oh, you're muted, Deborah.
It's a classic way to start.
There we go.
All right, just let me know at any point if there's any problem with the setup here. But I'm really just so pleased to be here with you tonight. I want to really start by saying what an honor it is to be part of this series, and to just applaud you and your whole team at Dyckman Farmhouse for the amazing work that you have been doing to really address some of the issues that this series represents. So bravo and thank you. So tonight, what I would like to do is share some examples of the ways in which museums have effectively responded to many of the questions that are looming so large in the hearts and minds of Americans. Our fight against racism and the marginalization of immigrant communities, the lack of diversity in the cultural sector, the deep inequities in our economy, our education system, our food waste. I'm afraid the list goes on and on. The examples that I'm going to share will stand in for work that's being explored by many museums, large museums, small museums, art museums, history museums, all sorts of museums. We will pause to think about why this phenomenon of museums engaging in issues of social equity and justice have sort of been in historical fits and starts and not been a sustained effort throughout the history of American museums. And I also want to do a little bit of brainstorming. I hope we'll do a little bit of Q&A after I'm done. To think about what would make this work more sustainable and for museums to stay focused in a long-term way on the topics of social equity and social justice. So fair warning, I think often when I talk about this subject, I end up raising more questions than I answer. And so, forgive me for that, but I'm a museum educator at heart, and I always think that asking hard questions is the right way to go. So that's what we'll do. Let me start with a tiny little history lesson. We are not the first generation of Americans to have our cultural institutions pushed to address the pressing social issues of our day. If I may, here are a few historical markers for this conversation. In 1909, Charles Cotton Dana, a librarian and an educator, became the founding director of the Newark Museum, which he described as a museum of museum experiments. I love that phrase. Dana believed that libraries and museums should personify democratic ideals and that they should be places where communities would come to be connected to contemporary issues, contemporary industry, design, and the celebration of everyday life and the ordinary, and things which would represent the people who came in to see them and would recognize themselves. These would be places in which poor and working class people should be comfortable and feel at ease and at home. In brief, Dana describes what he called the new museums. They are not to be storage warehouses or community attics or temples of dead gods or copies of palaces of extinct nobility or costly reproductions of ancient temples or grand and elaborate structures which are of service only as evidences of conspicuous waste by the rich and ocular demonstrations of the unwise expenditure of public funds. Above all other things, said Dana, the new museum should begin by collecting ideas. So in a sense, that's what I'm after tonight. Moving forward to 1942, in the midst of World War II, Theodore Lowe, a museum educator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, penned an essay called "What is a Museum?", in which he writes at length about the mandate of museums to help democracy triumph over fascism, even referencing the need to counter the preponderance of disinformation, and, to quote Lowe directly, to be at the front line in the struggle to preserve social freedom. I was really taken by that, his calling out the idea of disinformation at this particular moment in time. With that preface, I'm going to turn to some slides. So if you just bear with me for a moment, I will share my screen with you. Is that okay? Everybody can see that?
Looks great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to fast forward now a little closer to our time. And I want to ground my comments in the important work of an artist named Fred Wilson, who in 1993 created an installation called Mining the Museum. The exhibition was at the Maryland Historical Society, and it was developed in collaboration with the Contemporary, which is a contemporary art museum in Baltimore, and challenged the public to think about all of the ways in which racist attitudes have been traditionally embedded in museum collections. Excuse me. And how the history of slavery and racism is evident not only in what museums have collected, but what they have not collected. So what you're looking at here, I'm showing you two slides from Fred's installation. And this, as we noted as we were getting ready for this talk, at first glance looks like a beautiful image of an installation of gorgeous 19th century silver. And upon second look, right in the center of this installation, which was in a glass case, a traditional museum case, are a set of slave shackles. And the theme of this part of the exhibition was just labeled Metalwork, 1793 to 1880. In this second image from Fred's installation, this was a part of the installation that was called transportation, modes of transportation. And you see a buggy that would have been drawn by a horse, and you see baby buggies here. And again, when you look carefully at this slide, I think you can see in the foreground, in the baby carriage that's right in front of us, there is a KKK outfit, costume, I don't even know what we call it, set of sheets, which Fred deliberately puts into the baby carriage to give us a kind of a shock to our system as we go through his show. So I just wanted to give you a sense of some of what's in this exhibition. As the museum field vibrated with interest and excitement when this show was put up, that's really was a kind of bold installation. The visitor studies revealed a kind of underbelly of public response. And let me just quote one of the responses from the visitor study that was done at the time. A 62-year-old retired dentist responded to an exit survey and said that the exhibition had the ability to promote racism and hate in young Blacks and was offensive to me. When I read that quote, what it did for me was it was impossible not to connect it to the current peculiar responses that we're having amongst certain people and certain governments who are sure that teaching the history of slavery will promote white children to have low self-esteem. It's this kind of weird twisting of the attempt for people to see history for what it really is. The installation was referred to also as an intervention, and it sent really shockwaves through the museum field. I would suggest that Mining the Museums is really the opening, the beginning moment when the current wave of work that we are all engaged in trying to shift museums to address more directly social justice issues begins. And I just want to connect that then to some of the examples that I've been quite taken with in the field, beginning with this installation, Reggie Black's public projection, No Records, which was a projection on the Dykeman farmhouse, I believe a year plus ago. And we can certainly talk more about it, but an incredible, powerful statement, it seems to me. And I wish I had seen it in person, but happily somebody took some beautiful slides of it or images of it. And then I want to also just show you this image from a recent exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, the exhibition called Reconstructions, Architecture and Blackness in America, which was a really kind of interesting and very conceptual exhibition, bringing together the ideas of Black architects who have not always had the voice in major museums that they were given in this exhibition. They're just two examples, and I want to bring now my conversation to some of my own work that was in the period of time between 2006 and 2020, then when I was the president of the Brooklyn Historical Society. And I want to talk a little bit about those exhibitions because of my strong sense of what they meant in the context of this conversation. In 2007, we launched at the Brooklyn Historical Society a series called Public Perspectives, which was an effort to invite the communities of Brooklyn to come in and curate exhibitions, whether they had the experience and the knowledge of what it even means to be a curator, but if they had ideas about exhibitions that would be meaningful in the context of a history museum and a local history museum, we wanted to cede our authority and really turn over our resources to community members to do these exhibitions. One particularly successful installation was called Tivoli, a place we call home, curated by 3 residents of Tivoli Towers, a large affordable housing project in Crown Heights. The 3 curators were photographer Delphine Fawunda Buford and filmmakers Scott Braithwaite and Anthony Clouden, who turned their attention and their cameras to the daily life of this close-knit Mitchell-Lama apartment building, which was in the throes of confronting a deteriorating set of conditions in the buildings and the threat of gentrification. These 3 curators produced a vivid picture of a community that was on the verge of a legal battle with their landlord, who was trying to convert the building to market rate apartments. This would have resulted in basically forcing out almost all of the current tenants of the buildings. The exhibition became the hub and a kind of lightning rod for community meetings with politicians, with housing activists, and with the tenants, who used the exhibition to build awareness of their situation and to create pressure on the landlord. The result was that the building's affordable housing status remained in place at least for the next 30 years. But Public Perspectives, that series, didn't take us far enough to remedy the painful, skewed collection of the Brooklyn Historical Society, which had an abundant collection of 19th century portrait paintings, largely of white men. how were we possibly to think about understanding the real history of Brooklyn and its vast immigrant populations, which, by the way, are about 40% of Brooklynites to this day are people who are born in other countries. Its history of agriculture fueled by slavery, its growing Muslim population, 10% of the New York City schools are actually Muslim students. How are we to make the collections speak to the complex and diverse and ever-changing story of Brooklynites, especially with the likes of one Philip Livingston and his friends crowding our storerooms? Philip Livingston, as an aside, was actually a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was also a very significant slave owner. So we took on a new initiative. The Brooklyn Historical Society began to redress the painful silences in our collections with a robust effort to collect oral histories throughout the borough. As the collections of oral histories grew at the museum, we welcomed communities once absent and invisible and saw them become central not only to the collections, but also to our programs and our family of visitors. Within a matter of 5 years, we literally changed the ability of the museum to tell the Brooklyn's history, introducing new voices and new ideas. The stories did not merely live in a database of the museum, although they are in the database of the museum and you can find them there, but instead they became a springboard for listening sessions at libraries and at other local sites. This is a listening session of oral histories at Weeksville Historic Center. They also became the center and focus of our curriculum and website. This is a website for a project I'm going to talk a little bit more about called Muslims in Brooklyn. Most importantly to me, I think, not only were the oral histories used by scholars, by students, high school students, college students, but in addition to that, they were used by the people who had given us the oral histories. So we would get calls from people who wanted to use an oral history at a memorial of someone who had given us their oral history, but since passed away. Or somebody who wanted to share an oral history with somebody on a birthday, on the occasion of a birthday. And to me, those were the great moments of doing this, because these oral histories belonged to the museum for safekeeping, but in truth, they are the narratives of the people whose stories are being told. Muslims in Brooklyn was one of the largest of our oral history initiatives. A multi-year project launched in 2017 and directed by oral historian Zahir Ali. It was designed to amplify stories of Brooklyn's diverse Muslim communities through a combination of oral history interviews, programs, podcasts, and exhibitions. The project, like all of our oral histories, was about listening and learning. But it also prompted the Historical Society to fill other gaps in our collection. So here are, this is Camila Rashid, who did an installation that was inspired by the oral histories. And this is one of the oral histories being taken. In the midst of this project, our director of history spotted an important land deed that was up for auction, prompting us to raise the funds to purchase the deed, which was for 200 acres. Think about this. This is in Brooklyn now. 200 acres of land sold to Anthony Van Sally, the first known person of Muslim origin to settle in America. Not far from Coney Island, dated 1643, the deed is signed on the back by Peter Stuyvesant. The land deed is used actively now by teachers in classrooms, by scholars trying to track down more information about Anthony Van Sally. and it's featured in the Muslims in Brooklyn website. I want to now shift just briefly to another example, not at the Brooklyn Historical Society, but an example that exemplifies the current commitment to social justice and the good work that museums are doing as they double down on their commitment to playing a role in the efforts to support the Black Lives Matter movement and to move the needle in fulfilling a commitment to social justice made by many institutions after the brutal killing of George Floyd. This is a self-portrait by an artist named Russell Craig, and it was in an exhibition called Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, that took place at PS1 in Queens. It was curated by Dr. Nicole Fleetwood and features the work of 35 plus artists who currently make art within the confines of the US prison system. In speaking about this remarkable and brilliant exhibition, Dr. Fleetwood said in an interview that I heard on WNYC, I'm sure you can still find it, and I'm paraphrasing, if this show accomplishes what it should accomplish, we will have accomplished a change in museums, a transformation. Museums will no longer be about excluding people, collecting some things while devaluing others. Museums will become sites of belonging and creation and coming together. It's hard for me not to hearken back to Charles Dana and to think about his aspirations for what museums should really be as well. The dynamic projects that we're taking a look at are representative of, as I said, hundreds of other great projects that have been generated in museums in the last several years. And it gives me great hope to think that museums really do have a place in contributing in the movement for social justice. These exhibits affirm that museums can play a part in pushing back against a tidal wave of injustice in our society. But lest you think that I am overly optimistic that our work will continue unhampered and unhindered, I would like to close with some sobering thoughts about institutional commitment and institutional bravery. In her excellent blog called Museum Commons, Gretchen Jennings writes about the zeitgeist of tyranny. In it, Gretchen draws our attention to a text I consider essential reading for our time, a recent book by Tim Snyder called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. In times like these, Snyder is referring to the Trump era, during which authoritarianism was and still is on the move. Individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want, and then start to do it without being asked. This anticipatory obedience is exemplified by two incidents that involve the National Archives and the Library of Congress. After acquiring photographs of the January 2017 Women's March and planning to use them in two separate exhibitions about the history of women's rights, the Library of Congress pulled an image entirely from its exhibition. It was meant to be a huge wall mural, a giant wall mural, and they replaced it with an entirely different image. The archives made a decision to modify a photograph, blurring in their photograph an anti-Trump sign that was in the foreground, thus altering the historical record regarding the opposition of millions of women to Trump at that Washington, D.C. demonstration. Both institutions anticipated opposition to images that showed derogatory signs against Trump. Although the institutions have since apologized, these incidents are chilling and should be a warning to all. that the corruption of our institutions can happen within a matter of minutes, of months, of weeks, and that good people can easily become players in a shift to an authoritarian state. And while I am encouraged by the steady support of many, many foundations who have been giving to the important intersectional work of artists, museums, and social justice communities, I am also genuinely concerned about the likely ebb and flow of these funds. What happens when the next pandemic hits and requires those funders to move their monies to life and death efforts? What happens when the next tsunami hits and those funders need to deal with disaster? And two, I am worried about the boardrooms of our museums, where too many of the trustees serve our museums because of their deep pockets and their ties to big business. How will these trustees help our museums withstand the pressure for anticipatory obedience? I believe that there is a conversation we need to have that involves rethinking of our governance structures and the lack of public funding for the arts. Dependence on our wealthy donors and the lack of public funding goes hand in hand. And lest you doubt my analysis of our public funding woes, think on these facts for just a moment. Using the 2018 federal budget, the federal government invested $393 million in cultural institutions that year. The federal budget for the same year was $4.2 trillion. That means in 2018, 0.009% of the federal budget was dedicated to arts and culture. This is not an aberration. This is a typical annual budget. Increases in government funding undoubtedly has its own set of challenges. The obvious question being, what happens when the fascists are in power? To which I respond, perhaps this should make those of us in the arts more dedicated to our fight for democracy, for freedom of speech, for voting rights, and perhaps we will find the strength to sustain our commitment in social justice and democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. I would love to dive into some Q&A, if you don't mind.
Maybe not at all.
Okay. So let's see. Our first question here is, with some of the articles referenced in the beginning of your talk, how were these received by other museums or museum professionals? Did it spark any conversations?
The first part of your, that was around.
It said with some of the articles that you referenced in the beginning.
Well, that's a great question. I think that Charles Cotton Dana was actually taken very, very seriously. People watched what he was trying to do in Newark at the Newark Museum, but he suffered, I think, from some of the very problem he knew he was up against, which was right next door in New York City were these great, storehouses that he refers to, right? The temples, where, I mean, his commentary is not very well disguised. So it's pretty clear what he's reacting against. I think that the power of his work actually has increasingly become meaningful to people over time. And that he may have been to some extent, less in the center of the conversation when he was founding the Newark Museum. It's also interesting to note that he was in charge of the Newark Library, the public library. And so that relationship between libraries and museums is something that he understood very deeply, and that I think people really lost track of until very recently, when more and more people have started to take a look at the two.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, the next question is, how do we start to change boards when so little money is coming from government and so much comes from private donors with deep pockets?
That's what I want to
You can't
know.
answer a question with a question.
It's an age-old trick, Meredith. In truth, I think I guess I have two thoughts. One is that I think it would be entirely reasonable for the museum and cultural community at large to start pushing hard for more public funding on all levels, local, state, federal. And I think, honestly, the time to do that is probably now, because we have taken a turn to make ourselves more relevant, more meaningful to communities. And it seems to me far more likely that we could get community people to speak up on behalf of our institutions when we're in this state. Mm-hmm. The truth be told, if museums are irrelevant to people, who's going to fight for that money? Who's going to stand up? What politicians are even going to say we need to expand these budgets? I think the relevance that we're creating provides us with an opportunity to actually go for more funding.
Yeah. Okay, and then now someone says, to follow up on that last question, what models other than the standard board model can we follow? We know the typical model is perpetuating harm and is in dire need for change.
So quite a few museums have begun to expand the notion of their boards in some interesting ways. What I've seen is a lot of museums having artists join the board or scientists join the board, depending on what kind of museum it is. People who have content knowledge, who can speak up in that regard, very helpful, and gives an opportunity to really expand the notion of what a board is. And the other thing that I have had experience doing that I think is actually a kind of exciting way to change the dynamic is to invite people onto the board who actually have expertise, and their presence on the board is in exchange for their expertise rather than their money. That can translate into all kinds of interesting pro bono possibilities, right? People, giving their services. If you're in need of marketing services or technology services or legal services, those folks don't necessarily have to come to you with a deep pocket. They could just come to you and say, I'm willing to give you this much of my time. And I've had that approach has been very, very well received. By the time that I had left the Brooklyn Historical Society a couple of years ago, our board was made up of 35% people of color, which was, quite a dramatic change from where we started. And part of that some of that was people with deep pockets, and some of that was people who joined us in order to give of their knowledge and expertise. It's a start. It's not the whole answer, but.
Right, of course. Okay, the next question is, mining the museum was quite a while ago. Do you think there is anything more recent that has had that kind of an impact?
Well, I guess what I was trying to make the case for was to some extent that mining the museum did lead us to these other very interesting, a whole new wave of exhibitions, of considerations for collections. I think I didn't talk as much about the changes in collections, with the exception of the Van Sally that I mentioned. But the truth of the matter is that that many, many museums have been quite deliberate in realizing that their collections were of a very small sliver, the upper echelon, sort of upper class approach to collections. And that has really genuinely begun to change. And I think that is partly the result of mining the museum and the kind of realization. What is interesting about the comment is that 1993 seems like a really long time ago. On the other hand, I often describe museums a little bit as dinosaurs. So they kind of take a really long time to change. And so from my perspective, to see the change, even if it took 20 years or 30 years, is not such a terrible thing. It's way better than this exhibition having been an aberration. And I think what you can see is, you wouldn't want to see a copycat version of Fred Wilson's exhibition. What you're seeing instead is just people really turning a lot of the field on its ear and doing very different exhibitions that look at the work of artists of color, that feature artists of color, that feature difficult questions about inequity, about racism. You see that, you've even seen that more recently in children's museums, where they're actually tackling some pretty tough subjects with regard to racism and bias and prejudice in all kinds of ways.
Okay, the next question is, do you think libraries are doing a better job at change than museums?
That's a great question. In some respects, I do. In some respects, I think museums have a lot to learn from libraries, which they're actually more responsive. And part of that is they can be because they're not putting together the narratives. What they're doing is providing access to the information and letting people go away and absorb it and create their own narratives. So I'm not trying to diss libraries, because I think they're doing an amazing job of listening carefully to what people want and need and responding to it. You see libraries with technical assistance in media, in computers, you see language classes, you see resume reviews, you see, you see degrees for people coming out of prison being offered. I mean, the array of services is remarkable. And I think that is partly because libraries are not anchored and sometimes weighed down by, the collection, the house, the, whatever it is, the set of, hallowed halls of, massive installations that can't just be disappeared tomorrow. So, I think there's a reason why museums go slowly, but I think sometimes it's too slowly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next up is, are more people representing diverse communities recognizing museums as institutions that can effectively address and discuss issues of social justice? Is the museum field attracting more diverse people?
Good question. Let's answer this together, Meredith.
I would say my answer is, I don't think that the museum field is attracting more diverse people. I think that the museum field, both higher education and the museum field in general, people are becoming a little bit more self-aware and realizing that these institutions have exclusively been not available to most minorities, not open, not welcoming. And so I think that it's these institutions kind of opening their eyes and getting with the program and realizing that it's 2022. That's my answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think even just following your trajectory, part of the thing that I see happening that, I don't know how it's going to work, is museums finally realizing that they can draw upon people from other fields and, bring people in from, whether it's from the academy or from, some other related field, to become part of the institutions. But I worry a lot about, if you haven't fundamentally changed the culture of these institutions in the long term, they're still not going to be open enough, welcoming enough, open to change enough to really change that dynamic. I hope that I'm wrong about this, but because I don't know that that the museums will survive as they exist, right, unless we make that kind of change.
Yeah. And then we have maybe more of a comment than a question. Some museums are attracting more diverse people. Some museum programs are training more diverse people. It will take time for those people entering the field to change those institutions.
Yes, I agree with that. And it's a hard job.
Yes.
It's a hard job.
And, and as you said, museums move at a slow pace. So yes, it will take some time. All right. Well, thank you. I love the Q&A. Sometimes the most fun part of these, because it's such a great way to engage with the speaker and the audience. So I love all the questions. So Deb, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was a fantastic discussion. I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free programming like this. Gifts in any amount are always much appreciated. Also, I'd like to remind you that this is the first in our series of 4 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Join us here every Wednesday after tonight at 6 p.m. on Zoom. Be sure to register through the links in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. We will see you here next Wednesday, February 16th at 6 p.m. for Courageous Conversations with Ty Jones and Michael Dinwiddie. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your evening.